Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air tonight. It's myself, David Bell, and Stuart Mannon's sitting alongside of me rather than on screen. Hi Stuart, welcome along into the Lion's Den here in the study. Stuart's going to be asking me some questions as we go through this evening, and the talk is all about designing ministry. Now, I've put together this particular sequence so that I can actually use it for carving up into a series of videos later on to fit into our Leadership Plus micro-mooc. But just at present, Stuart, we haven't got any viewers, but there'll be people that watch this after the broadcast. So would you like to say one or two words about yourself?
The answer is no, not really. But if you would like me to say, then I ask myself, what do I think would be useful to say about myself? So then I've got to say, who's listening? You describe the person that you think is going to be listening, and I'll tell you what I think might be useful.
No, that's no good. You can't do that. We're broadcasting. You've got to. I'll be able to edit that out because there's no one watching at present. But that was no good. No good. Okay, so I'm going to start this again. Good evening, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I've got Stuart Madden sitting here next to me rather than on a TV screen. Stuart, would you like to just say a couple of words about yourself, what you do, what you used to do in your working life?
I'm a retired music teacher. I used to lecture in music education for many years.
Yeah, and we've both got a common interest in aspects of music education generally, the psychology of life, the anthropology of life. There's a whole lot of things that we've got in common. We've got a terrific amount of shared background, and that's why I wanted Stuart to come in and be with me tonight as we talk about designing ministry. So I'm going to bring up our first set of questions, and let me just grab that. What I'd like to do, Stuart, is tonight talk about designing ministry using a method that Edward de Bono, the great guy on lateral thinking, what did he have to say about how do you design ministry? Well, he didn't talk about ministry as such, but he talked about designing in all kinds of aspects. And he came up with this amazing word, PO. And PO was short for provocation. And to get traction in doing new things in ministry, what we have to do is look at making some provocative statements. Now, de Bono really highlighted provocation by talking about movement and operacy. And let's just see what he actually meant by that idea of movement and operacy. Well, he said provocation, and I'm sorry about the spelling mistake, it will be corrected for when we send out. Provocation could be described as discontinuity or even madness. We're going to have some really provocative situation. And in order to get a new design for a better way of doing things, what de Bono proposed was that you had to create a new idea or see a provocation at work for some time, and then use operacy, know how to get things done to create a change. Now, Stuart, the particular example that I want to just use at this point is the idea of a factory that's making pollution. It's next door to a river. And how do you force the factory owner or the company to overcome their pollution issues? And the answer is, well, you could move the factory away from the river, or you could say, what if we moved the factory upstream? But that's, well, that is a provocation. But how about, if you think about it, the river moves down. What if you made the factory draw its water from downstream? Then it would be drawing dirty water into its system. And by that simple act, you can actually force the factory to do something different. it doesn't want to take polluted water into its system. So that's what De Bono meant by a provocation. Stuart, have you ever, just out of your background, have you ever come across any similar sort of things?
I probably have, but the word provocation in this setting is so new to me that my mind is reacting in a different way. I like the idea that to be effective in this, and design is finding an effective way of meeting a problem, is you've got to upset the apple cart from the expected in some ways.
Yeah, very much so. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It is about upsetting the apple cart. Now, I see we've got a couple of viewers have come online, and by all means, you should be able to use the chat pod to make short, brief comments or ask brief questions. We're talking about designing for ministry, and what I want to do, without any further ado, is bring up an example of how not to design something that occurs in our local church context. And if I just bring that up so that everyone can see it, have a look at this and have a think about it. Stuart, there are 3 photographs there. Are they familiar photographs to you?
Yes, I see them every Sunday morning.
And of the 3 photographs there, what's the most effective as far as you're concerned?
The middle one.
The middle one?
It has a hint of mystery.
It's got nothing on it.
Tabula rasa.
Okay. Let's work backwards through these 3 signs, because I think they're very interesting. So the top sign has got 2 languages, Korean and English. And the English language sign actually has a photograph of the church and a design element. It's very faded now, hasn't been changed in donkey's years, possibly even since the church was open. I'm not 100% sure about that, but the second Korean sign has come in. So you've got 2 signs that are actually saying different stories, aren't they? You've also got a sign further down that says welcome. Now, this to me is the most unappealing sign in the whole of the site. It's painted grey. The words welcome are in red, which is usually a sign for go no further.
Danger.
They're not even painted onto the board, they're painted onto something that's stuck on the board, and there's been a big hole down there in the left-hand corner for a considerable time. So when you start to add the first sign and the third sign together, we've actually got something that is creating a provocation, but the local church hasn't managed to get any movement or operacy with it because the situation has been there for a number of years.
But could I say, I don't think that provocation is planned. If you look at the tacit meaning of welcome, you could have written there, beggar off. And the message would have been more clearly, we're not interested in welcoming you, but this is a polite way of doing something.
Right. So you've got a little bit of signage there that's not communicating well. But interestingly enough, you thought that the middle sign that said nothing was the best of all, and because it created an air of mystery. In actual fact, when the building was first put up, that sign held the key safety information for the fire brigade. If there was ever an emergency, the diagrammatic map of the site was there, but it's since disappeared. Now, I'm not doing this to be critical of the local church situation. What I'm trying to say is, here's something that a group of people who are very keen about ministry no longer see the problems associated with that particular set of signage. They've just learnt to ignore it. Whereas for any stranger passing by, what you've got is a highly confusing set of signals that indicate there's a complete lack of design. Now, possibly some people that are watching this are also in that congregation, so I'd be very interested in your comments and feedback at that point. Do you have any point that you wish to make at this point, Stuart?
Yes, I'm quite interested in that first sign, because I think it's an example of hiding behind words. Knowing somewhere inside you that something needs to be done. We ought to have a community that's welcoming to strangers. That's a good idea. And we're hiding behind this word welcome. And it's not being welcome at all.
Yeah, it's there's no design, no thought of design about what you're actually trying to communicate. So in a real sense, design for ministry is going to involve different aspects of communication. And the fact that in the back of that sign, the essential safety information for the fire brigade is no longer there, hasn't been there for some time, doesn't put the matter right. Well, we've got a question that has come through. What would I suggest? What would you suggest, Stuart? Let me just select that question. So, Max, what would I suggest we do? Well, Max, I'm really glad you asked that, because the answer isn't to have a church meeting or a church property committee or whatever talking about this, because good design rarely happens out of committees. Stuart, you got any comment about that?
Yeah, well, I'm a little left brain in this kind of thing, but I'd like to think I've got enough right brain to compensate for it. I'd want to say, what are we trying to do by this notice? Are we trying to project an idea that we welcome all different kinds of people? And in fact, we have two different cultural groups that worship in our church.
And welcome is, I'm not sure whether it's on the Korean sign or not, but it's certainly sitting there in a very odd place with no other language mentioned at all. And in fact, how do you convey a sense of welcome? Do you convey a sense of welcome by writing the word welcome?
No more than you convey a sense of worship by saying, we worship you, O God.
Well, I couldn't have put that better myself. So let's have a bit more of a think about this, Max. I've put up three categories: design, small-scale design, large-scale design. Now, I'm not sure whether Clive Dyson is watching this, but Clive has got some very clear ideas about design and the scalability of design. But it seems to me that you start with the idea that whenever you're designing anything, be it print, be it sung music or played music, whether it be a photo, a graphic or whatever, what's the feeling that you want to communicate? And the feeling is not in that design. And so I would say that the right place to start is thinking about, if we redesign that notice board, what qualities of what goes on inside the building can be put onto the notice board? And that is a much harder thing to think about than just putting some information up, which is where most churches were at in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Men's breakfast, women's fellowship, you know, a list of activities, as opposed to how do you communicate the feeling.
In fact, here's a case for seeing the importance of pictures rather than words.
And when you say picture here, I think you're not meaning a photograph. If I can go back up to the previous image, Oops, I'm sorry, I just moved a bit away from that. Just bear with me 1 second. I want to, I'll just stop sharing for the time being, and I'll bring it up in a second. What I want to do is highlight the fact that the building itself got photographed and put on the sign. And I'm not being critical of the design process that went into that. That wasn't my design process. That was other people's design process. But are you communicating, what are you communicating when you put a photograph of the building which is immediately visible? To me, it looks more like a real estate sign. Is this building for sale?
Mm.
In fact, maybe if we replace the welcome sign with for sale, we might have a better match of ideas. So, Max, what would we suggest that could be done here? Well, I want to suggest that in terms of small-scale design, the small-scale design that goes on the notice board has to be of a similar quality, conveying a similar feeling to what goes in the bulletin week by week, to what's produced live on air week by week, to all the aspects of ministry that's done in that place. And so the small-scale design is actually capturing the large-scale vision. And that's why it's impossible to get design by committee in these instances. What you have to work at is hiring a very well qualified, iconic designer to do the thing. So I think we've done answering that question, and I'd be very interested if there are more questions now. I'm just going to bring the slide back up again. Whoops, there we go. Share that screen, and just bear with me 1 moment, folks. Just got a slight thing that I've got to do here just to get that. That's it. Didn't want to get to there. So with apologies. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next aspect of what we're talking about in terms of design. And the next thing that we want to talk about is how do you start to generate new kinds of design ideas for ministry? So once again, I'm just going to see if I can bring the screen share up. I think I lost it actually. So yeah, I have lost that particular design thing. So I'm going to just ask you to bear with me while I do something a little bit different for bringing it up. Okay, we're looking a little bit more healthy now. So I'll just bring it forward. We're going to talk about the structure and the anti-structure, and how you have right brain and left brain working away, doing things that move us forward for operacy, that move us in terms of movement, that create provocation. Now, Stuart, what do you understand by the term left brain and the term right brain? How would you talk about these?
I think I'd use them in this kind of context, that part of our brain is very structured and it's logical, and it moves from A to B, often at the expense of being imaginative and tying in with our feelings rather than our cognitive processes.
Right. So things like feelings, imagination, etc., you would see as a right brain activity, as opposed
not
to
exclusively, but mainly. Yes.
mainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mainly.
I don't think we can be 100%
that's
in
right.
either camp. Yeah. So the first thing that I think we do in terms of design for ministry is understand how ministry often subverts itself from being what should be communion into what is organization.
Mm.
And that is where I think the signage thing has come undone. You can find lots of examples though beyond the signage thing. We don't want to just put words up or photographs of our organization. We want to convey the sense of here is a community. Now, if you take one of the great leaders of the 20th century, Max de Priest, a fantastic Fortune 500 company, he would talk about communion as being an essential part of the organization structure for his employees. And he would work assiduously at making sure everyone felt they were in communion with one another. He saw covenant as far more important than, say, contract.
Yeah, I think this is part of a bigger thing for me, or another way of looking at this might be considering the two words means and ends. We have things that we think are really important, and let's hope they are our ends. But we have ways of getting there. Now, it seems to me that you can confuse the two, and once you see what is really a means as an end in itself, you're in for disaster.
Well, I think means and ends, yes, that's one way of looking at it. Let's go a little bit further down and talk about ambiguity and certainty. I think in the anti-structure, in the right brain, we are much more comfortable with ambiguity. And the ambiguity of signs and symbols and icons and so on is that they point, but they point generally. They don't actually lead you on a string to the end, if you like.
They haven't arrived.
They haven't arrived.
There it is.
But the structure wants certainty. So let's stick with that word communion now. And what goes on in most Methodist churches, certainly Anglican churches as well, and Presbyterians, and most definitely in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, is that they organize and they have certainty around what the communion is all about. But having that organization and certainty doesn't promote communion amongst people. All it does is distribute some elements of bread and wine and say, oh, we've arrived, we've got communion, because we had the elements.
Another way of looking at it would be to say that there's nothing wrong with having certainty or organization, but when it takes over from real communion, or actually inhibits communion.
Communion being that kind of fellow feeling that grows, look, I'm with someone or some group of people who really do understand what Christ's message is about.
And that's a relationship.
It's a relationship.
Yeah.
Christ is alive amongst us.
And that's the kind of core we're trying to get towards. And all the other things can be good or bad, but are only means of getting to that end.
Right. Now, I think I begin to see, here's one potential symbol that could go back on that signboard. The symbol of the chalice in pattern. No, and you don't say, oh, communion every Sunday or anything like that, but simply the chalice and the pattern. That's the kind of icon that communicates a feeling about community. There's an ambiguity about it. People say, well, I'm not sure. Am I allowed to go and take communion there? Or you know, what does it mean?
But that's art working.
That's drawing you in, as opposed to putting the certainty of saying, oh, there will be communion once a month. Okay, now I think we're starting to get a little further down the track, and we come to what I think is the absolute key tonight in terms of structure and anti-structure and how you can create provocations. Doesn't matter what the organization is, it will involve anything that's structured. No matter the best will in the world, there will be a degree of systemic evil. There cannot possibly be anything other than evil within a structure, because the structure itself is all about preserving the structure as against preserving the people. That doesn't mean that, you know, an institution like the local Methodist or Presbyterian church is systemically evil, but it has the potential to be systemically evil by virtue of being a structure. At the same time, over in the anti-structure, there's what I'd call, and I love this word, diabolical evil. Now, this is diabolos, the devil. And when I'm living in communion, when I'm living in ambiguity, when I'm living with feeling, all of those kinds of things, there is the chance for me to be tempted to work systemic evil. So the personal demon within me, the things that drive me, and I'm not saying that diabolical evil is all bad. It only becomes bad if I don't recognize the diabolical evil within me.
It's acting in that way that doesn't recognize what you're doing. That is the big mistake.
And that's exactly true in systemic evil as well. So let me give you an example now. Some of the people watching may want to feed in at this point. I think a good example of systemic evil in the church is the way in which the Methodist Church has organized itself so that there are now remarkably few systems for feedback within the church. Virtually every organization, major organization in New Zealand, has a Facebook page. And if you didn't get satisfaction from a particular branch or a particular customer interaction, you can write on Facebook, well, I think that, you know, you need to improve this, etc. It allows feedback, and it gets rid of the diabolical evil in you to make your particular comment about the system. But when the system doesn't allow for that level of feedback, I think we've got a major problem. And that, of course, increases the level for diabolical evil to be committed by the individuals. Now, this again is part of Max de Prey's understanding that any organization, any business, any church has to operate out of a communion, a relationship of people, and people are all, to some degree, flawed. The systemic evil of the structure is in trying, is when it fails again to recognize and mitigate against the diabolical evil, and vice versa. Any comments about this, Stuart? I think, for me, this is just the most powerful kind of biblical insight. There is this diabolical evil within me.
I think of different levels of dealing with this problem. And the problem you raised was not allowing sufficient technique for feedback. Now, you can go to at one step, you can never ask for it. And then you'll get no criticism. The second is to say the right words. We would like people to give feedback on this morning's service, for example. But unless other things support that, you are hiding behind words.
I think the difficulty that I've got with comments about services, etc., is that not everyone that leads worship or takes services is open to that level of criticism. And that may be because they're beginning and so they're not comfortable with that level of feedback. And of course, taking services occurs relatively infrequently. It's not like being a classroom teacher where you're actually got class contact hours, 22, 25 hours per week in front of a group, that you're often dealing with the same methodological, pedagogical issues. In the worship situation, particularly if you're a lay preacher, you may only do 3-4 services per annum, and that may be around different groups of people. So I don't actually see that as being particularly important. I think there are other more helpful ways of garnering feedback for the Sunday morning worship. But I think that the church that only gathers for Sunday worship and does little else during the week is missing out to a very large degree. That's a kind of a systemic evil, a systemic oversight, that there are other things that it should be doing, and perhaps feedback is more naturally incorporated around those other areas.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we haven't had any questions yet, so either they've all gone away and had a cup of coffee, or they're agreeing with us, or they're so disagreeing with us they don't know what to say. So let me bring the next thing up.
We welcome your feedback.
We do welcome your feedback, yeah.
Be brave.
We're coming to the question of structure and anti-structure. The anti-structure takes you to the edge of the abyss. This is where you don't necessarily know what is the right thing to do, what is the right path to take. There could be very big issues afoot. They may be personal family issues, there may be relationship problems, whatever. The same occurs within the structure, but here you're on familiar ground. And is it Shakespeare that says familiarity breeds contempt? That's one of the
good
parts. Yeah. The more familiar you are with things, the more you take them for granted. The more that you wander the edge of the abyss, the more overwhelming life can seem. So you're caught between structure and anti-structure. And the left brain, right brain is moving between these two all the time. It's weaving a pattern that starts sometimes to take it to the edge of the abyss and sometimes leads you back into familiar territory. Now, how does this relate back to De Bono's idea of what is the provocation, what's the movement, what's the advocacy that we're going to use for that movement? Sorry, I lost the word. It's not advocacy. It'll come back to me. Anyway, the point is that when you're at the edge of the abyss, that may be your most creative moment in life. Because the issues are big, because standing at the edge of the abyss forces you to suddenly reevaluate things. Now, let me give a concrete example. Stuart, you've been through a number of near-death experiences, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah, you're probably going through one now as we do this live on. What did you learn? Because you stood at the abyss between the border of life and death. What did you learn from that?
Well, I overall, it wasn't a bad experience. I came through it when I was revived by my wife, and I'd started breathing again, and my pulse had started again after about 10 minutes with CPR. It was quite pleasant. I had the typical tunnel experience with the light at the end of the tunnel, but I remember thinking afterwards, when I recovered, it wasn't too bad at all. I wasn't scared. It was quite pleasant.
So what about pain? Was there a sense of pain to do with the physical?
Well, the last thing I remember was vomiting, and that I didn't like that at all, and I didn't like this feeling of losing control. But once I got past that, it seemed very, very peaceful and comforting.
So there's a typical NDE, near-death experience. Not everyone feels that way, but certainly the loss of control. If I can just for a second bring the PDF up again, just bear with me. What we have when we're at the abyss of death is loss of control. You cannot stand anymore on familiar ground. But what you felt was that even though you weren't standing on familiar ground, the experience was not unpleasant.
That's true.
I think that's a relatively common in the kind of experience, but not, as I say, not everyone does that. Some people find that the loss of control is absolutely diabolical.
Devastating for them.
Absolutely.
But here's another thing. A lot of life's response, emotional response, is in terms of judging experiences in black and white situations, where most psychologists would say we live on a continuum, and it's good to go to the abyss. Or as I heard in church once, it was the great abyss. And I burst out laughing and then realized I was the only one in the congregation that had understood this. So at times we're on the great abyss, and at times we're in very familiar things. It's a bit like someone with bipolar. I've got a friend who, when he's in the depths of despair, is at his most creative moment. And he's a mathematician.
Oh, yes,
his problem is that when he takes medication, he loses that upper experiences, becomes more mundane, but a far better colleague to work with in the institution that he was working with at the moment. But what my point is, we need to find a balance between these two things.
Right. Now, I think De Bono was onto this. The word I was looking for wasn't advocacy, it was operacy.
Oh, yes.
And operacy is when we're on familiar ground. When we're on familiar ground, we can do things logically. We can organize. We know the system. We know how to move it from, how to get things done, how to take it from A to Z.
Or, who was it? Well, Einstein says logic will get us from A to B, but from A to anywhere requires imagination and creativity.
Yeah, exactly right. And so that's where De Bono's idea of movement, that's the abyss, that's out in the abyss, that's somewhere else, that's the discontinuity, or as he himself said, De Bono said, sometimes could be described as madness. So that brings us to logic and intuition, which I think are probably the most common ways of understanding the structure and the anti-structure. The left side of the brain is the logic side of the brain. Now, I'm a very logical person. I enjoy mathematics. I enjoy music, and I think music has its own inner cause of logic. But also, I recognize that intuition, working with the anti-structure, is probably the most creative way of doing ministry. It's not certainty of telling us that we're having community, or certainty of saying, you know, we've eliminated diabolical evil in our church, or the certainty of saying, no, we don't need intuition. All of those left-brained ideas are fantastic, and they give operacy to things, but they're not actually the prime movers, particularly in church. The prime movers are communion, ambiguity, the recognition that within us there is the temptation for diabolical evil. That's the evil that we tempt ourselves with. It doesn't come from some external devil out there. It's the devil of Mammons, it's the devil of Bel, it's the devil of the three viewers. And there's intuition as well. So building design for ministry is actually about thinking, acting as if intuition mattered more. And I believe in the long run it does.
And you can have a structure with the left brain predominating that's predictable and logical and a lot of things, but boring.
Yeah, and of course that's one of the
and that's what people opt for, and that sends people away.
Yeah, well, you mean people in church opt for that?
Yeah.
In the belief,
when they do, in any institution.
Yeah, I think it's everywhere. It's systemic, if you like.
I mean, it's just as much in teaching as it is in religious.
Yeah, for sure. But what church offers that I think is an exceptional thing compared to other institutions in society is the fact that because it doesn't meet all that frequently, it should meet more frequently than it does, but because it mostly operates 2, 3, 4 times a week in people's lives, it does mean that ministry can be better designed to meet more people's needs on those occasions. What we've got at present is an overall lack of design for our ministries, plural.
For effective communication.
Yeah, communication, but also the sense of creating communion, covenant, all of those things. Well, I think we've really given this a fair old whack. We only had the one question, but I'm very grateful, Max, for that coming through. I hope that the others have enjoyed this, and we'll chop this video up into separate component parts during the week so that it can be slotted into different parts of the Leadership Plus course. And I'd just like to advertise the fact that the Genesis and Science group is now open in Kiwi Connection. If you belong to it, you do have to commit yourself to sharing some of the resources around on social media. They really are still very, very good. You and I worked on these years ago. Adam and Eve and Evolution, Stations of the Cross. They're all coming out, and they're coming out in really great packages. You can only get them in Kiwi Connection. Some of the resources we make, the micro-moocs, are for anyone, they're public, but for these resources, you've got to be in Kiwi Connection and connected and in communion and loving and living the ambiguity. So Stuart, thanks for coming in and sharing with me.
I'd like to say one thing, if I could. If we've said something tonight that has caught your quick, remember, it comes from our experience of messing things up. I'm not talking for David, but I am for me. And if there's some insight where I think I could improve, really that's the motivation for sharing it with you, that you might find the same kind of solution. So in my kindest way, I say good night.
Thanks, Stuart. Good night.